All right, there we go.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to our ORCID and Funding Workflows community call. This is our November community call, so I really appreciate you all joining us today and spending some time with us. Next slide, please. So today we have the link to our agenda, and hopefully you are able to see that right now, and I'll go ahead and share it on our chat as well. So right now your microphone is muted. However, you can always ask your questions through the chat box throughout the presentation. And after the presentation, we will go ahead and unmute the sound, and you'll be able to ask questions, make comments, and basically share your thoughts about the presentation. The slides and the recording will be shared after the presentation, maybe later today or tomorrow, and we will share that to you all. Closed captions is also available for you, so you should be able to see that in one of the controls, and you can just click that and be able to see the closed caption. Next slide. So as our community calls, we do have some norms that we usually follow to kind of guide us through all this conversation. We do expect and also make sure that everyone engage in respectful discussion, and also feel free to ask any questions and seek clarifications as needed, and also be receptive to feedback from others. A lot of this, our community calls, as there's a link for our LYRASIS Code of Conduct. Feel free to check that out if you want to take a look at. Next slide. And this is your community, ORCID US Community team. So I'm Paulo Guhilde. I'm the ORCID US Community Specialist. And of course, we have Sheila Raymond, which she will talk in a little bit. And Sheila is our program leader for persistent identifier communities. Next slide. And this is our agenda for today. Today we were going to talk about ORCID and funding workflows. So we have a general overview of ORCID and funding, primarily looking at the different sections in the ORCID record. And Sheila will also talk about the ORCID funding identifiers. And then we'll talk about what funders are using ORCID for. And then we have case studies, and we're joined by two guest speakers today, which Sheila will introduce later, from American Heart Association and Melanoma Research Alliance. And then after that, we will have a Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paulo, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I think somebody asked a question in the chat, which is, will the recording of this be shared? And yes, we will share this recording after. So just stay tuned for that. And if you have to leave early, no worries, because we'll have the recording for you. I'm just going to give kind of a brief overview of where ORCID really fits into funding workflows. And then we're going to hear from our guest speakers, and we'll have time for discussion and questions toward the end. So if any of these topics that I bring up right now, if any of these are of interest to you, if you want to learn more, just, feel free to speak up when we get into our discussion. This is going to be just kind of an overview to get us started. So first, kind of the benefits of ORCID for funders, really, we've distilled it down to this, which is that ORCID makes it easier for funders to know who they're giving funding to. So being able to kind of assess who their awardees are and their awardee network and kind of influence. And then also ORCID makes it easier for funders to evaluate their grants and their programs, looking at the output from that grant funding and trying to get a handle on impact and return on investment. And ORCID does this by providing a shared kind of standard and persistent way for all funders to, one, uniquely identify the researchers that they're working with and stay connected with those researchers as time goes on. Two, streamline this collection of data or information about the researchers that are getting funding and those researchers' activities to kind of see, okay, what has this person done? Where did they go after they got our funding, et cetera. And then three, ORCID allows funders to kind of confirm those relationships with the researchers that they're working with in this wider landscape of scholarly communication. So getting research funding, doing the research, publishing the scholarship, sharing that out, etc. And so funders can really take advantage of ORCID, and primarily this will show up in the systems that funders are using to connect with researchers, applicants, awardees. The first thing that that funding systems can allow for with regard to ORCID is signing into a system using ORCID. The screenshot that you're seeing here is from a system called Proposal Central, which a lot of funders use. And so when an applicant or an awardee goes to log into this system, they have the option of logging in with their ORCID ID, so they don't have to remember yet another password, and they're uniquely identified with their ORCID ID from the very beginning of logging in. Funding systems can also allow users, researchers, to import information from their ORCID record into the funding system. The example that I'm using here, there are Proposal Central is one of the systems that allows for this, but there are other systems. The example that I'm using here is Science CV. I think a lot of people are familiar with Science CV because it is what the NIH and NSF use for applicants to create a biosketch that meets their requirements. So with Science CV, people can actually import information from their ORCID record into their Science CV biosketch. So down at the bottom here, you're seeing there's an option to choose an external source to import data from, and we have that set to ORCID. And then just another screenshot here illustrating that when somebody is working in Science CV and they've connected their ORCID ID, they can actually, for example, select which publications they want to import from their ORCID record into Science CV. So that's just one example of how it can kind of save time and make data entry easier for applicants. Not only applicants, but also awardees when they have to do a progress report and report on their activities to their funders. This can come in handy and save a lot of time there as well. And then funding systems can also allow for data to go the other way. So if somebody has received funding from an organization, that organization can actually add that funding entry to the person's ORCID record. So the example that you're seeing here is for somebody that received funding from the Children's Tumor Foundation, which is one of our ORCID members. And you can see in the highlighted section with the arrow that the source of that funding information on the ORCID record is the Children's Tumor Foundation. So that just yields a bit more authority to this assertion that this person received funding from this organization. And that way, when this person goes and maybe applies for funding to a different organization, or maybe they work at a university and they have to go report their activities to their university, this information is already in their ORCID record and they can send it to the other organization. So this really works as an ecosystem, with ORCID as kind of the central hub for storing data about researchers and their activities that can then be shared in a trustworthy manner with the organizations they're working with. So as I mentioned already, the funding information can be added to somebody's ORCID record through a system, basically using the ORCID API, but funding information can also be added to an individual's ORCID record manually by that person. So there is a search and link option in the funding section of the ORCID record. So what you're seeing on the screen here is my ORCID record. When I'm logged in, I can select the search and link option to add funding information to my ORCID record. And that basically takes place through the Dimensions Wizard, which is essentially a database of funding information. So as a researcher, I can go into the Dimensions Wizard, search for my name, see if any of my grants are in that database. And if they are, I can just claim them to my ORCID record without having to sit there and type everything in. But if my grants are not in that Dimensions Wizard, I can also add my funding manually to my ORCID record by just filling out the form that's in the ORCID record in the funding section. So you're seeing here, there's funding type, title of the project, description, funding amount, date, funding agency, grant number. So all of this information can be added directly by the individual researcher too. And I also want to point out that in the works section of the ORCID record, there's now an option to include funded by information. So if I published a paper that was related to funding that I received from a grant agency, I would enter the work information here, but then also I would select funded by, and I would be able to add unique identifying information for the grant or the funder that provided the funding for this work. So these are the areas within ORCID and within the ORCID record where funding information comes into play. And this funded by section, this is very new. This was added, I think, just within this last year. But so it is possible for individuals to add that funded by information to their works in ORCID themselves, and it can be added if a work is getting added to somebody's ORCID record through the API, that can be included as well. And I talked about identifying information about the grant or about the funder. So I just also want to talk about a few other related identifiers in this funding space. So the first one is the Crossref Funder ID. So Crossref is a DOI agency, basically. And you might have heard of this referred to as FundRef ID, but technically I think it's the Crossref Funder ID. And that's basically a unique identifier, a DOI basically, for the organization and the funding organization. So this Crossref Funder ID is used to disambiguate the funding organization itself. And so this screenshot here, I just went to the Crossref site and searched for Melanoma Research Alliance, and then you can see all of the publications and things that have that relationship to Melanoma Research Alliance using these identifiers. There's also another relatively new identifier for specific grants, and that's called the Crossref Grant ID, basically, which is a DOI that is assigned to a specific grant. Normally, we're used to seeing DOIs assigned to journal articles, for example, but Crossref can also assign DOIs to a specific grant so that when you publish an article that was funded by a specific grant, you can include that grant DOI in the metadata of your article DOI. So it's all just designed to tie all of this information together and make it easier to find. So those are just a few other identifiers to be aware of in this space. And these can also be used in the metadata within ORCID when you're talking about funding, or if you're talking about a work that was funded by a specific grant or funder. I also wanted to just give everyone an overview of what funders are using ORCID. This is just a snapshot. This is by no means all of the funders. There are many more, but just from the snapshot that you can see here, it is a lot of health research funders kind of leading the way right now. And other kind of more hard sciences are either requiring ORCID IDs from their applicants or their awardees, or they're asking for an ORCID ID. Maybe it's not required, but it is part of that application or reporting process. And the first few funders that are listed at the top that are in bold, these are all organizations that are ORCID members through our ORCID US Community Consortium. But there are many other foundations, funders, government agencies that are also ORCID members that aren't part of our consortium, but they're still participating in this space. And speaking of government agencies and government federal funding, it's a little bit scattered across the board right now in terms of what different federal agencies are doing with ORCID. I think many people are already aware that the NIH, the AHRQ, and the CDC right now are requiring ORCID IDs for individuals that are involved in certain types of grants, so research training, fellowship, research education, and career development awards. They have to have ORCID IDs. The DOE, Department of Energy, they also lead the US government ORCID consortium, which includes other federal agencies and also a lot of the national labs in the US that are especially DOE funded labs. So some of the national labs and user facilities require an ORCID ID for proposal submission. If someone wants to use that lab, sometimes they have to provide their ORCID ID. And some of the labs and facilities also use ORCID to identify people in their HR systems. Examples of some other agencies that are ORCID members, but they might not necessarily be requiring ORCID IDs in their workflows, at least not yet. EPA, FDA, NASA, Smithsonian, and USDA are all ORCID members, but they may or may not be requiring ORCID IDs. I haven't heard that any of them are requiring it yet, but they are ORCID members and are using ORCID somewhere in their workflows. But I also wanted to let everyone know, especially if you weren't aware of this yet, that soon all of our US federal agencies will be required to have some sort of policy related to digital persistent identifiers for individuals that are receiving that federal funding. So let me talk just a little bit more about this. This is a screenshot of a slide from a NIST presentation. But basically this highlights wording from a recent executive order related to basically national security in terms of research and national security policy. So in the highlighted section, you can see here that it says individual researchers supported by or working on any federal research grant, there will need to be a policy related to that person being registered with a service that provides a digital persistent identifier for that individual. They don't say ORCID, but as of right now, ORCID is really the only service that meets that requirement right now. But basically, this is an executive order telling all of the federal agencies that each agency has to come up with their own policy. So we'll have to just kind of wait and see what those policies are going to be. But my understanding is the intention behind this is to standardize the disclosure process. So if somebody is applying for funding and they have to disclose to that federal funder, you know, who they've worked with in the past, what other research they've done, et cetera, they're really looking to a digital persistent identifier to be able to standardize that process. And I believe that all of the federal agencies are kind of working on coming up with their policies. It might vary. Some of them might require ORCID specifically or not. We don't really know yet, but this kind of hints that most likely, you know, something is going to change at the federal funding level related to a digital persistent identifier or ORCID. So we're just going to have to keep our eyes on this. I believe the agencies are receiving more guidance around this month. So this is just something to be aware of. And if I hear of more updates around this, I will definitely send out announcements on all of our ORCID US community channels and that kind of thing. So pretty exciting, something to be aware of. And if you know of more information about this, definitely feel free to put it in the chat or bring it up in the discussion. So I think that's it for my overview. Now I'm going to hand it over First, we're going to hear from Belinda Orland, the Senior Manager for Research Operations at American Heart Association. And so Belinda's just going to tell us a little bit about what they're doing at AHA related to ORCID. And then next, we're going to hear from Kristen Mueller, the Scientific Program Director at the Melanoma Research Alliance. So I will go ahead and stop sharing and hand it over to Belinda.
Great, thank you. I just have one slide I'll share to kind of keep me on target here to talk a little bit about what AHA is doing. It's great to follow you, Sheila, because you've already talked about so many of these things. I can just say, and like Sheila had said earlier. So just a little bit of a timeline for American Heart Association and what we've done with ORCID to date. Got a lot of colleagues on the phone, so they can jump in and correct me or add to as well. But we really kind of started this back in 2018. We were using a custom grants management system at the time. And so we actually were requiring awardees to enter an ORCID, but we weren't verifying it. We didn't have an official ORCID membership at that point. As long as the numbers matched with the format we were expecting, we accepted that. But it was great because it kind of caught us back up for several awards that started even earlier than that. We can say we know everything that was active as of 2018. We've at least captured something as far as an ORCID record. We didn't have pushback. I think people were afraid. We have a lot of people saying, I can't do this, whatever. And we really had none at that point. And so in June of 2020, we actually became a member of this ORCID consortium, and same time as us implementing our proposal central grants management system, which has the integration, of course, with ORCID, like that you've shown. And then we actually now require an ORCID for all application submissions. This is something that our volunteer group had really pushed for, and we were now able to do this. And again, I'll just kind of say here, we didn't receive negative feedback at this point. There was no one that was saying, I'm unwilling to apply, because I'm not willing to do this. So not a big hurdle. Of course, we kind of worked through making sure the instructions were there, and we provided support for that. But really excited that now, as of all applicants, as of June of 2020, we now have an ORCID that's been verified for them. So we've actually done a lot of encouragement too, in like monthly newsletters, things like that, where we really are encouraging them to trust AHA, and provided some detailed instructions on exactly how they could go in and do that. And then I guess I'll say that currently where we are with that, a year after pushing that, we actually have 92% of our active awardees that actually have an ORCID now. So still there's some longer awards that maybe were in from prior to 2020 that don't, but 92% do have an ORCID. And of those, the key number that Jamie helped me figure out from Altum was that 81% have trusted AHA, which is great, because again, besides just putting it in a couple of newsletters, we haven't and don't have the capacity to reach out, and do a lot of hand holding on this. But with a little bit of education, we've got 82% that said, yes, they would trust us. So this kind of goes to the last point on my slide, or the last milestone we kind of came across, was that in July this year, we began pushing award information to their award records. So we'll do that most likely twice a year. And then we do have plans to go back and place some catch up. I'm not sure how far back we will go. First, we wanted to just kind of get a regular process in place to push that information out there. And then, we're kind of just looking at in the future, if there's, I know Proposal Central is looking at the ability to push peer review information onto their records. We haven't made final decisions about that, but again, just encouraging folks to take advantage of this and all the advantages it keeps them from having to rekey things multiple times. So we've had a good experience. Our volunteers have been happy with our progress as well. So any questions about AHA activities around ORCID, or other comments from AHA folks on the call? All right, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much.
I do see a comment in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Melissa was asking about messaging to have people trust AHA. So I'm not sure if the question is about what does it mean to trust. or what our messaging was. But basically, they have to authorize us. They have to authorize, anyone. They have to trust Proposal Central. They have to trust us, anyone who might potentially push information back to their ORCID record. Of course, they always have ultimate control over what's on their record, but we do want them to authorize us as a funder to push information out there. Right now, it's just we're putting information about awards that they've received. So we actually have screen prints of here's where you would go in and what you need to click to say, I authorize AHA. So that's the type of messaging that we have around authorizing or trusting us.
Wonderful. Thanks, Belinda. And I'm seeing some other questions and comments coming into the chat, but I think we're going to hold off for now and hear from Kristen at Melanoma Research Alliance, and then we'll go and we'll look at the chat, and we'll also let people unmute so we can have more of a conversation and answer any questions then too. But that's really exciting for AHA. Thank you so much for this update, Belinda. And that sounds amazing. 92% of the awardees have an ORCID ID and 81% have connected with AHA. Those are really great numbers. Okay, so maybe Belinda, if you want to stop sharing your screen and we can turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you. So I just have a couple of slides here. Happy to talk about it. And I think maybe some of them will answer some of the questions that were coming in for Belinda, because I think a lot of what Belinda's experience has been at AHA is really similar to where MRA, the Melanoma Research Alliance, is with ORCID IDs. So I just put this first slide up here just to give you a sense of who we are and the scale of our grant program, because I know everybody's is different, but we're relatively small. We grant like 10 million a year, and that's about 30 to 40 awards. So, to date, we only have 380 projects total, and we do use Proposal Central as well for our grants management system. So, for MRA, I think the thought process around starting to collect ORCID IDs, joining the ORCID consortium, and actually I'll talk about another persistent identifier, DOIs. It's really come about because we just think it's really important for the funding community and the research community more broadly to start adopting these persistent object identifiers. And for us, we feel like, similar to things that Sheila raised and Belinda too, is that we're looking to reduce the administrative burden on applicants and awardees as they complete their applications, as they complete their progress reports. We feel like it increases the overall transparency and discoverability of MRA's research awards. It also, both for our awardees, for others in the research community, and for MRA itself, it makes it easier to track research outcomes for our awards, and then really to capture a much more complete and accurate information out there about what has come from MRA-funded awards, so that we can report back to our board, to our constituents, and make decisions about our strategy going forward. So similar to Belinda, we started requiring ORCID IDs for all applicants, actually in 2017. So then all awards that we made in 2018, the awardees had ORCID IDs that were associated with that. And similar to AHA, we didn't have any pushback either. We anticipated there might be a little bit, but there were none. We joined the ORCID funding community in about a year ago now. And then about less than a year ago, we started requiring DOIs through Crossref for all of our awards. We started making those and asking that our awardees use them. So really just trying to link all this information so that hopefully in the future we'll be able to use it to be able to, for us, help inform our evaluation process of our awards program. So I just decided to pull a couple screenshots from Proposal Central to kind of make you understand that it's pretty easy to actually implement this once you join the community and want to have your awardees start to trust you. So you can kind of see here, we made it a deliverable. So it's right up here with their progress reports where they're authorizing, they're essentially trusting us that we can push things to their ORCID profile. And so they do that. We can see that they've done it. If people haven't done it, we can pull reports. We can go back and remind them to do it. And I think as of this past year, once we joined the ORCID funding community, we're making this a required deliverable for the activation of their award. And then when you actually want to go to write your award to their funding profile, you're really just clicking a checkbox here and saving it. I think you can do it in a manner that updates things in batches, but it's really pretty simple, and it gets written to their award profile. And then I think, Sheila showed something similar, but this is one of our awardees from this past year. And now we can see, this new award from 2021 is written. And then hopefully as she, has different research outputs associated with this award, she'll be citing the DOI that's associated with this that'll be tied to her ORCID ID, and it will just make it a lot easier to track what happened from this particular funding, and then of course writ large across our awards program. And so I think this is really where we are now. And I would say, in 3 years, I can tell you a lot more about how we're using it in grants evaluation, because we're sort of doing a big evaluation project this year. We do it every 3 years. And it's just, we're not to the group of awards where we started to collect ORCID IDs yet that we're evaluating, but in 3 years we will be. And so I think it will hopefully make our process a lot more streamlined. So I can share more then. So I will stop there and take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen. That was really helpful to kind of see behind the scenes within the proposal central system, where you're tracking on these things. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and make it so that people can unmute. You can also turn your video on if you want. And while you're thinking of questions and stuff, I'm also gonna turn to the chat and see what has been said or asked. Let's see. Okay. So I think I'm seeing a lot of comments about the executive order and stuff about the federal funders. I do want to point out that in the agenda document for today, in the agenda section, I do have a link to the executive order. I don't know, everything I know about this, I've already said. So if anybody on the call knows anything more, feel free to unmute and let us know. So I don't really know anything about the timeline. I think it's within the next couple of years, the agencies will need to have their policies. And then, we'll go from there. This is a link to the memo, which I've also seen it referred to as the executive order. So anyway, that's kind of as much as I know. I don't think anybody who, works in the federal government, they're not really allowed to speak publicly about this or something yet. So I've just kind of gleaned as much information as I can. And I think for all of us, it's just something to be aware of, and maybe we can all just kind of try to find out more information and keep each other posted if anybody finds out anything else. Okay, let's see. I do see one question about, again, related to the federal requirements, if there will be any requirement for what is entered on the ORCID record in addition to having an ID. I have no idea. And again, I think it's going to differ from one agency to another. They're just supposed to be coming up with policies related to a digital persistent identifier. So we'll just see what comes out of each agency. So as of right now, I don't know. Okay, so there was another question directed to Belinda, but also I think Kristen could speak to it too, or anyone else, feel free to pipe up. Can you talk more about your messaging to have people trust AHA? That's the question.
So I think that's the one that I tried to answer earlier about,
Oh,
how we
right.
put that, yeah.
It's in the newsletter just saying like, hey, connect your ORCID ID with us.
With instructions on how to do it so they don't call us.
Right. Perfect. So yeah, the trust, basically when somebody, so for example, if you're using a system that has an ORCID API integration, individuals can go and connect their ORCID ID with that system, basically trusting the system or the organization, and that organization will be listed as a trusted organization on the person's ORCID record. And then we also saw, Kristen showed us the workflow for pushing that award information to ORCID. So it might vary depending on what systems are being used, but definitely within Proposal Central and that screenshot we saw from Kristen, it's just checking a box and clicking send to ORCID. There's some behind the scenes technical aspects that are already set up in the system to do that. Another question, I guess, for our presenters, are you pulling publication data from ORCID into your grant database?
So I'm a little bit confused about this question, but I think that, like, in other words, they do have the option, if they've updated something in their ORCID, they can use that to pull down for their science reports, etc. Does that make sense? So we end up with that information entered on their science report as an example. So I think it goes both ways. I think that's my understanding. That's why they have to authorize the software vendor as well as authorizing AHA as far as the integrations. They're separate authorizations that have to happen. But
yeah, that's my understanding too. I think they can automatically pull for their progress reports, and then we pull that into our master database of all publications related to our awards.
Great. And then we have a comment just saying it would be great if you got to the point where, for example, AHA awards are pushed like even more regularly to people's ORCID records as they get them. And Belinda, did you already say how often y'all are doing that?
Well, we only start awards quarterly, so we've had the July ones, and then we have just only a small handful that are kind of exceptions in October. Our next big one will be January. So for sure we'll do twice a year. That's when we have large award starts for our group. But I mean, potentially we could look at quarterly, but we don't have monthly, additions. We kind of group them for various reasons.
Okay, great. And then there's another question. What is the LOE to push out info, and who is doing that for you? Not quite sure. Anyone?
Kristen showed that, just it's a feature within, that's how we handle it. So you would say, everything since this date. So in our case, the answer is it's a feature within our grants management system. I'm not sure if there's others out here that do it in some other fashion.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be the most convenient when that feature is already built into whatever system that you're using. But if you do have authenticated ORCID IDs and access tokens for your researchers, you could, write information to their ORCID record. But yeah, it's definitely easier when that's kind of already built into the workflow.
And I do see another question coming up, just saying like, do you recommend going ahead and collecting them before they're verified? And in AJ's situation, I would say yes. actually, attempted to use some of these ones that were just from awardees and weren't verified, and they're pretty decent. So it's, better than nothing when you're trying to look for a career progression. I mean, it's so useful for so many things, to have that ORCID ID. So I would say, don't wait for everything to be lined up perfectly, et cetera, right system, right things, but I would suggest collecting them in whatever fashion you could as soon as possible.
Great. Yeah. I mean, and it's also never too early to tell researchers about ORCID so that they can start, being like, oh, do I have an ORCID ID? Oh, you're going to be asking me for my ORCID ID. What's that? That kind of thing. And we do have resources from our consortium to kind of help with that messaging. So if anybody needs help with talking to researchers about ORCID, let me know, let Paolo and I know, and we can help you with that. I do see a question of whether award information can be pushed to ORCID records while using a grant management system other than Proposal Central. I know there's at least one other called Smart Simple that I think is also a service provider for ORCID that can push the information to the ORCID record from within the system. Off the top of my head, I don't know of others right now that have the ORCID API built in. So that's another thing that we do as part of our consortium activities is if you are using a system, whether it's a grant management system or anything else that does not have the ORCID API built in and you want to have that functionality, let us know, because we do like email templates. So any customers of a particular system, you can just kind of copy and paste this email template and let them know that as a customer of whatever system it is, we'd like to see this. And vendors are more likely to listen to their customers asking for new features. So, but also, it just kind of depends on what system you're using, what kind of staffing and resources you have. We're more than happy to talk one-on-one with any of you if you want to learn more about how you can use ORCID at your own organization. We can kind of help you figure that out, because it does vary a lot depending on what systems you're using and the kind of staffing that you have. Okay, let's see. A question for Belinda: what do you do, or what would you do if your researchers don't make that trust connection with AHA?
Well, yeah, I was very interested that Kristen in her presentation talked about that they require them to authorize in order for their award to be activated. We haven't gone that far. We still say, you're in complete control of your ORCID record, which they are, so I hadn't been so bold as to kind of push that, but we can go back now and say, MRA is doing this and see what our volunteers might think about that. But in general, I don't know how, if Kristen's question, if you push something out there and they don't want it on their ORCID record for whatever reason, I guess they can delete it or reject it. But it's not a requirement that we don't have anything in our award agreement that says we require that we can push things to your ORCID record. So it's optional. I think most of them would want more information on their ORCID record, but we've not pushed that far to, we can require that we have the ORCID, but we've not required that they trust us.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important concern. I mean, I could see you have a much larger portfolio than we do. And so I think if people had concerns, I'd be certainly open to having a conversation. But, of the, I think 48 awards we did this year, nobody expressed any issues, and they all just trusted us, and it was seamless. And I think right on ORCID, people they can choose like a private view of their profile. Is that right? So you don't have to let everyone see what's on your profile, I feel like.
Yeah,
so
that's
I guess
right.
I just sort of thought that was an option, so they could decide not to show it if they didn't want to.
That's correct. Yep, they can make their information public, private, or to trusted parties only. So yeah, absolutely. And who knows, maybe the people that haven't made that connection yet, it could just be because they forgot, or maybe they didn't see the email, or maybe they didn't want to for some reason. But But yeah, it never hurts to kind of go back and just say, hey, you haven't done this yet. You want to do it now? But AHA, I mean, 81% connecting, that's really amazing. Another question for those using Proposal Central, is the ORCID push completed automatically, or do you have to ask Proposal Central to complete the push quarterly?
I think it's just that checkbox that I showed on the sort of main screen. And I think it's just a matter of on our side, checking that box, hitting save, and then it's really fast. I think I did one yesterday that we hadn't written for some reason, and it was there as soon as I went to the profile after I had clicked it in Proposal Central.
Wonderful. Another question, does my organization as a funder need to be an ORCID member before asking my researchers to trust my org? Yes, you do, because in order for your researchers to connect their ORCID ID with your organization as a trusted organization, you have to be using the ORCID API. And so for organizations, it's the ORCID member API. So once you become an ORCID member, then you can set up that process where your researchers trust your organization, and you can do this pulling information in from ORCID and also writing funding information to the person's ORCID record. And if you're interested, if you're not an ORCID member and you're interested, just get in touch with us and we can point you in the right direction. I'm putting our email address here for the ORCID US Consortium. So that email address is in the chat, and also feel free to reach out to us for other questions too, especially if we run out of time or anything like that. We're more than happy to talk to everybody as much as possible. Okay, there are a lot of chats. Let's see, what more do we have? Can external services query an API to get the grant IDs from your systems, or do you recommend another method? So the grant IDs, I guess it would depend. If you're using that Crossref Grant ID, then you should be able to use like the Crossref API, or even if not yet, eventually the DataSite Commons search interface. Does anyone else want to speak to external services querying grant IDs from other systems? And also feel free to unmute anyone who's here.
We've never at AHA approached something like that. In other words, we are pushing any information that we choose to push, out into external services that we would use for additional analysis, if it's going to dimensions or if it's, whatever we are, sending it off somewhere else. So I don't know that that's an option, and I'm not aware of who I want anybody coming after our grant IDs in our system.
Okay. That makes sense. Also, just wanted to call out, there is someone in the chat saying, if anyone else is using Flux as their grant management system, contact Kristen Eldon. And that's completely fine. And yes, we can definitely use these calls to connect with each other and work together to get ORCID integrated into more systems. So for sure, if you're using Flux, let's see. And also just want to point out, if anyone has additional Proposal Central needs or questions after the call, there's a contact information for Mike at Altum as well. So feel free to contact them. We still have about 10 minutes left. Does anybody have more questions, more comments? Feel free to, unmute or put them into the chat. I hope this has been helpful. If nothing else, just bringing us all together to think more about ORCID and funding workflows. And
Sheila, do you have any information about what awardees are asking for? In other words, are they wanting funders to push more information like peer review service, et cetera? I mean, just curious if you survey or know, or what ORCID hears in terms of feedback from users that they're wanting that funders could potentially provide.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I saw that we might have some people from ORCID on the call. If anybody wants to speak to that, feel free to unmute.
Hey guys, this is Chris Shillham. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Chris.
Oh, perfect. I think, the use cases we've seen, and thanks so much for the presenters for presenting that, are really good examples of best practice with ORCID integration with funders, collecting the ORCID ID, and then particularly putting the award information out back on the ORCID record. That's where the value really accrues to everybody else. So, what I think we'd like to see is more and more funders implementing those workflows. And I think it's great to see those two really good examples of best practice today. We'd love for more funders to similarly implement those flows. And I guess one question I have is, it's striking that both of the examples we've seen today are enabled by the fact that Proposal Central has a good ORCID integration. So it would be interesting to hear whether there are other grant management systems that people are using that don't have good ORCID integrations, and maybe we could work as a community in encouraging those integrations to either be created if they don't exist, or to improve to support that kind of full workflow.
Yeah, good point, Chris. I would encourage anybody, if you are using a different system for your grant management, go ahead and throw it into the chat so we can at least start kind of looking into that and have an idea of what systems people are using. Yeah, and then in terms of like feedback from researchers, I think it's really just like as Chris was saying, the more organizations that can actually add information to researchers' ORCID records for them without the researcher having to constantly go back in and add their own things, it's just going to work better for everybody and save a lot of time for the researcher. Because as a researcher, you can then trust that the information is going to get added. You don't really have to worry about it, and it's going to be accurate because it's coming from the organization that you're affiliated with. So that's actually a really crucial piece in getting more researcher adoption too. If somebody signs up for an ORCID ID and then it just sits there and they can't do anything with it, and there's no information going in, and they feel like it's something extra they have to do, they're less likely to see the value in it. But if somebody signs up for an ORCID ID and they're like, oh, I'm getting a grant from AHA, I'm getting a grant from MRA, and they're using my ORCID ID to like automatically gather my information and also like confirm that I got these grants. And that same thing goes for like employment information, other affiliations, all of the information on an ORCID record. That really shows the value right there. Like, oh, I've got this ORCID ID and my stuff is already there and I didn't really have to do anything. And so, the more that happens, the more researchers will see the value and continue to use it. And, as more organizations adopt ORCID, it's just this big ecosystem where, everyone's participating and we're all saving time because of it. So, yeah, that's kind of my view on, what are the researchers asking for and how are the researchers benefiting? I would say they're asking for not having to spend as much time doing administrative types of things. And so the more we can leverage the ORCID API to help do stuff for them, the more it's going to help everybody. Any other questions, comments? I see it in the chat. Koali is one for award management. That's definitely one that we do have an email template for. A lot of the universities that are part of our consortium are using Koali. There's another one called, I think, Cayuse. there's a few of them that are starting to become aware of ORCID or might have it on their roadmap. They just haven't implemented it yet. So the more they can hear from their customers, the more likely we'll see that functionality. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Huron, I've heard of that too. Yes. Yeah, hopefully, you know, as time goes on, we're hoping to just see more and more built-in ORCID integrations with these systems that will make everyone's lives easier. Well, if you do have any other thoughts or questions that come to mind, you know, definitely put them in the chat or let us know. Let's see, I wanted to get my last little thank you slide up. Thank you all so much for joining the call today. Again, this is our ORCID US email address. This is for the ORCID US Community Consortium. So if you're in the US, definitely contact us and we'll help you. We'll get you where you need to go. And then we're also on Twitter at US Consortium. If you're on Twitter and you want to just stay in the loop there. But thanks so much again, everyone. Thank you, Belinda and Kristen, for being our featured presenters. I hope this was helpful to everyone. And we hope to see you again at one of our future webinars or community calls. Thanks so much, everyone. Stay tuned for the recording. Have a good day. Bye.